Welcome back. Stacking stats in FEH is not really uncommon, especially in modes such as Aether Raids or whenever you're doing stuff in Arena with drives or rallies, depending of course. But usually there's a means of getting around stacking certain stats. So for example, you could stack attack as much as you want, but if there's damage reduction, then it's going to be even more difficult for you to get damage out. However, there is one stat that does stand out comparatively to all the rest, and that is speed. I don't think there really is a shortage of people stacking speed on all sorts of units, whether fast or slow, to get the desirable result that they want. But I think it's also safe to say that stacking speed is probably the easiest and most abusable thing you can do in the game, because of the amount of skills and support that can be easily accessed. So, I want to talk about it for a bit. I believe, out of every single stat in the game, stacking speed is not only the easiest thing to do, but it's also the most abusable stat in the game. And I'll be going over all my reasons for it. Generally, when you're running a skill, more often than not, there's going to be an overlap between the amount of stats that are being granted. What do I mean by this? I mean mainly, if you're stacking one stat, you're more than likely to be stacking other stats. This usually can come in the form of skills such as ideals, or traces, or menaces, or anything of the sort, even blade session, for example. Granted, not every skill in the game will provide stats, but the amount of stats you can get from each skill does provide a pretty big amount of wiggle room. If you were to run a player phase kit, for example, you can easily stack anywhere between 20 to 33 speed alone before any weapons or support are taken into account, which is a lot. If you were to run an ideal and a catch, that's anywhere between 7 to 9 speed. You can run a lull or a trace for another 3. You can run a Menace, which is a 12-point stat difference, because not only does it grant 6 to you, but it inflicts 6 on the foe. But you can also run other consistent skills such as Joint Drive Speed or Rain, for example. And then going into the Sacred Seals, you could also run Blade Session, Attack Speed Solo, so on and so forth. But with these skills combined, you can easily just stack anywhere between 20 to 33 speed, and that's for the player phase. For the enemy phase, you have a lower floor, but you could potentially have a higher ceiling depending on the skills you run. So for example, if you were to run Attack Speed Unity, that's a minimum of 5. However, if you were to get penalties to your speed while running Attack Speed Unity, then you can end up getting an absurd amount of speed from that. So for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to say 12 plus, because there is a good chance that it could always go above that, but I'm not familiar with how consistent that may be, but even then, you're still getting a minimum of 5. And if you weren't running Attack Speed Unity, you could always be running Distant Pressure or Distant Dart, and that's still a minimum of 5. And then for Bs, you could still run lulls. I don't think you would generally be running lulls in the enemy phase. You can, but there's more competitive options, such as No Follow-Up and Spurn, especially if you're stacking speed. Those skills are probably going to be better. But even then, you can still run Rains and Joint Drives and even Breath, Solos, and Forms, which can grant even more stats. But with the enemy phase in mind, you can still get as much speed, if not more speed, because you're going to be bundling with allies more often than not. The 16 to 26 speed alone for the enemy phase may be on the lower side, because again, you'll be near allies a lot of the time in the enemy phase. So you can easily stack spurs and drives and even more of that. But my point is with all of this is that the kit alone, before any sort of support and weapon, can already provide a super good amount of speed. But if we were to take weapons into account, then that can also provide a significant stat swing too. PRF or not, most weapon types do have something that boosts speed significantly. Such as with swords, they have Ninja Katana and Rain Sword. Ninja Katana can't be refined, but it grants +4 speed and player phase Brave, which is still pretty decent, all things considered. But Rain Sword can provide up to 8 speed, provided that you refine it for speed. So that alone is already giving you a good stat swing. For lances, you have Piercing Tribute, Lofty Blossoms, etc., etc. Axes do have a bit of overlap with other weapon types, but they can still run Rain Axe and Ninja Masakare, and it still provides a good amount of speed. I would say Tomes don't really benefit as much, because their offensive prowess when it comes to their inheritables isn't nearly as good as the bows and daggers, even though they're all ranged. You can still run Fox Tome, and that provides a 4-point stat swing. If you were to refine it for speed, that's 6. Grace Tomes can provide up to 7 because the base effect already grants 5. I would say, out of all the weapon types though, the bows probably have the best options currently, mainly because a Springy Bow that neutralizes any sort of penalties to attack and speed, meaning that the only way you can really remove it is with dulls, and Whitecap Bow, which we just got recently, which provides player phase brave and attack speed 5, which can also then be refined for speed for, you guessed it, more speed. But there are daggers that can also provide a good amount of stats too, such as Courtly Fan and Bone Carver, that both provide speed on its own. And this isn't even taking preferred weapons into account, because those can also provide a decent stat swing, of course depending on the PRF. Like modern day weapons generally have like plus 10 to everything, so I'm not really concerned on that front. But if we were to take newer refines, it may be a different story. But then again, we got someone like Thea who just became a big stat ball. She gets plus 9 to everything in bonus doubler, so it really just depends on the weapon. But even then, you could easily stack 7 to 8 speed with your weapon, and then depending on the role, you could stack easily between 16 to 33 speed, which is massive when you put it into perspective. And you may be thinking, why speed and not any other stat? What makes speed so special compared to HP, attack, and defense and res? HP is going to be the trickiest one to compare to the rest because HP is just a flat stat. You can't really stack it compared to other skills such as defense and res and attack, but HP does depend on all sorts of other skills, whether that's damage reduction or having naturally high bulk. But that can always be torn down with area of effect specials, specials that reduce defense and res, and so on and so forth. And that's HP. But what about attack? As I mentioned earlier, attack can be mitigated with natural bulk and damage reduction. Obviously, nowadays, units are hitting higher and higher levels of attack, which is going to make it harder for units to tank in general, but that shouldn't take away from the fact that units with naturally high bulk or damage reduction are going to have the ability to soak. But then you also have defense and res. As I mentioned earlier with HP, this can be reduced with specials and high attack foes. So there is a cycle to this whole thing. The only stat that doesn't really have a direct counter outside of just getting more of that stat is speed. The only way you're really going to beat speed is by having even more speed, which can work depending on the unit, but depending on who's controlling what unit, it can make it a lot more difficult. In my opinion, you're never really going to be running a unit without any sort of support. It's not feasible, especially in today's day and age. So when you are running a support unit, there's plenty of things they can do to actually make speed even more viable. This type of support can be applied via visible or through spurs, and it can apply to every single slot in a kit. Weapons can provide spurs or visible depending on the weapon, of course. Rainax, for example, can provide in-combat debuffs on the foe, while something like Flower of Joy can provide visible buffs if they were to dance. But that also takes assist into account, which can also be bolstered with rallies. The A slot isn't typically known for support, but you can always stack life and death on certain units so they can soak debuffs that target attack and speed, which can actually be quite nice. For the B slot, it's kind of similar, but they have access to sabotages, which takes more visible into account. The only slots that really provide in-combat buffs are the weapons, and then your C and S slots. So for example, drives and spurs. You can easily stack sets that way. So imagine you're getting 30 speed from whatever kit you're running, and then you're getting an additional 10 plus or 20 plus, depending on whatever support unit you're running. It adds up really, really quick. But of course, it will depend on the mode, because there are going to be instances where you can't do the same thing you would be able to do normally in a mode such as Aether Raids in something like Summoner Duels. So for example, in Light Season, you can run Peony with Tamari Air. Peony can provide visible buffs, she can provide spurs through her weapon, she can provide even more spurs through her C slot and S slot, and that already provides easy 9 to 12 stats depending on how you position her. And then Air with a Tamari Dagger can actually provide even more debuffs on the foe. So you're already reaching a near 20 speed difference, which is pretty significant. You also have Astra Season with Plumeria, which isn't nearly as good. Even though she can run Sabotage Speed, she does come with it, but Peony does provide more utility, which is why she is better in that regard, but Plumeria can still do quite a bit. And then you also have Reagan, who can actually stack double life and death and just soak shrines, which is really nice. And with all this combined, you can easily abuse speed to the point where you're easily reaching 50 to 60 additional speed. So it's really easy to do it there. However, it's relatively tame in Arena, comparatively, because all you can really run is legendary bonuses, rallies, and maybe the occasional drives, but that may be even more difficult because you have to maintain a certain SP threshold, so it's not going to be as abusable there. And this isn't even taking into account the tech options, which can come about from stacking slower units. So for example, if they were to run sets that mainly focus on a particular stat, but take speed into account, then it can be used as a tech option. I would say Legendary Lilina is a popular option when it comes to this. Usually you're stacking double life and death, so her AoE does a lot more damage, but she can also run Wind Sweep and prevent any sort of counterattack from slower armors that may provide save. So there is merit to that. Seliph is another option. I don't really think it's the best option you could really do with him, but on the chance that there is no follow-up present, it is going to shut down his weapon, meaning that if he has to fall back on his speed, it wouldn't actually be the worst thing for him since he'll have a better shot at doubling regardless. So basically, units with guaranteed follow-ups can stack speed as a tech option just in case it gets shut down. But then you also have middling infantry melee units that can run Vital Astra. Usually you would pair this with no follow-up so you can get both damage reduction and no follow-up, which is why I'm bringing this into account. Skyhawk is definitely one of those options where you can stack speed on them, and while he isn't exactly the fastest, he does have the ability to make it so it works out for him. Especially if you were to run Vital Astra with no follow-up, he would not only get damage reduction, but he would be able to secure his own doubles. And I've just been going on and on and on about how it is a viable option, but obviously there are going to be arguments against it. I would say one of the more popular arguments is the foe can speed stack too, which can be true in some cases. However, it obviously depends on the mode. If it's for modes such as Aether Raids, then I would argue it's not nearly as feasible, since the player having control over their unit makes it a lot easier to abuse specific stats comparatively to AI that can easily be abused. I would say the only place it may prove to be a struggle is in Summoner Duels, since there's not only less wiggle room there, but you're not able to get nearly as much stats comparatively. And of course, there's also the argument that maybe faster foes will outspeed anyway, which is always a possibility. However, the amount of stat swings that can take place in any sort of situation can make outspeeding faster foes with middling base speed pretty easy to accomplish. The only other argument I can think of may just come down to stacking speed on slow units isn't worth it. And I agree. I agree with it to an extent. If you have the option to stack more natural bulk, it's better to take that route. I would say that it will depend on the unit, obviously. Like as I mentioned earlier with Legendary Lilina, who can run double life and death. In her case specifically, she can run Wind Sweep and she can just tech slower armors. But outside of specific examples I provided earlier, if your base unit has like 20 speed or like 15 speed, not really going to be worth stacking that stat, even if you have the possibility of preventing doubles, because at that point you can put the same amount of stats into your defense and res and take even less damage comparatively. But outside of that, I would definitely say that speed is probably going to be the most abusable stat you can work with, just because there's so many skills and support options out there. But you'll have to let me know what you think down below. What do you usually like doing with units that may have middling speed or workable speed depending? I like stacking speed. Obviously it's not always going to be viable, but sometimes it's just fun to stack speed on slower units just to see what they can do. But that's just my take. You'll have to let me know what you think down below. If you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.